Welcome, dear listener, to Gentle Historian, Medieval Life, where history is not rushed but carefully unfolded like the turning of an old parchment page. Tonight we invite you to step quietly into the dim and fragrant world of the Middle Ages, where the lives of women were guided not only by faith and family, but also by the strange and sometimes shocking customs of hygiene. If you enjoy history told in a gentle way, where stories are as much about relaxation as they are about knowledge, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence, even across centuries and continents, helps this community of slow history grow. Now let us begin our journey. Breathe, slowly settle into comfort, and allow me to take you back to an age where water was feared, perfumes were prayers, and the daily rituals of cleanliness were as mysterious as they were unsettling. Setting the stage life in medieval Europe, the medieval world was not a single uniform place. A woman's life in the damp valleys of France was not the same as one in the sun-scorched plains of Spain or the chilly cottages of England. Yet, across the expanse of medieval Europe, certain beliefs about health, purity, and the body echoed everywhere. In the 21st century, we take it for granted that hygiene means soap, hot water, and fresh clothing. But in the Middle Ages, hygiene meant something entirely different. It was woven together with religion, superstition, and social rules. For women, especially expectations about the body were tied to morality, virtue, and their place in society. Picture a village in the year 1350. The church bells toll in the morning mist. Women gather at the well to fetch water, their skirts brushing the mud. The air carries the smell of livestock smoke from the hearth and the ever-present tang of unwashed bodies. For these women, bathing was rare, and perfumes, or herbal sachets, were a substitute for what we would call cleanliness. Fear of water. One of the strangest beliefs of the medieval age was the fear of water. Doctors of the time warned that water could open the pores of the skin, allowing disease to slip inside. Bathhouses, once popular during the Roman Empire, gradually declined, as religious authorities condemned them as sinful places where the body was exposed and temptation spread. For women, the suspicion of bathing was even more intense. A maiden who spent too much time in the bath might be considered vain or worse, immoral. Many women were advised to avoid full immersion in water altogether, relying instead on wiping their face and hands with a damp cloth scented with rose water or vinegar. This practice led to what might seem to us a shocking contradiction. The more someone avoided bathing, the more pure they were considered by their community. The role of religion. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of a woman's hygiene. Cleanliness was not about germs, no one had discovered them yet, but about the soul. Monks wrote that the body was a vessel of sin, and to fuss over it too much was vanity. A woman who washed herself daily might be whispered about, while one who smelled strongly of sweat could still be praised for her humility. In convents, nuns were sometimes forbidden to bathe more than once or twice a year. Instead, they wore layers of linen undergarments, changing them occasionally to absorb dirt and sweat. The act of putting on clean linen was considered almost the same as bathing. For noblewomen, fine fabrics became both a symbol of wealth and a substitute for soap, perfumes, herbs, and covering the smell. To survive in a world of rare baths, medieval women turned to perfumes and herbs. Lavender, rosemary, and sage were stuffed into small pouches worn at the waist or stitched into the hems of dresses. Women carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with fragrant substances that they would hold to their noses in crowded marketplaces. Perfume was not merely a luxury. It was a defense. People believed that foul odors carried disease, so to smell sweet was to protect oneself from illness. Of course, the reality was that diseases spread in ways they could not yet understand, and perfume did nothing to stop the plague. But it offered comfort, and in a time of fear, comfort was precious. Imagine entering a medieval church on a feast day. The air is thick with incense, and the women in the pews clutch their scented pouches close, trying to mask the smell of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. This was the medieval version of deodorant, invisible but powerful. Clothing as hygiene. Another curious aspect of hygiene was clothing. Women were encouraged to wear multiple layers of linen, for linen could soak up sweat and grime. When the undergarments became too soiled, they were changed, and this changing of clothes was considered equivalent to washing the body. For noblewomen, this practice was almost an art. They owned multiple menstrual hygiene and childbirth practices. In the hush of medieval villages, one subject was rarely spoken aloud, yet every woman endured it: the cycles of menstruation and the mysteries of childbirth. Today, let us unfold these hidden aspects of medieval hygiene, revealing practices that might horrify us, yet shape the very survival of families and communities. Menstrual hygiene in the Middle Ages. Medieval understanding of menstruation was cloaked in superstition, medical ignorance, and religious judgment. Women were often told that their monthly bleeding was both a curse from Eve's sin and a necessary purging of the body's excess humors. Physicians believed menstruation kept women balanced. Without it, they might fall ill. Yet the practical side of managing it was left entirely to women themselves. Sanitary products, as we know them, did not exist. Women used rags of linen, sometimes referred to as clouts, folded and tucked into their clothing. These cloths were washed and reused, though peasants with little linen might have had just one or two worn until threadbare. Some scholars believe poorer women often bled directly into their clothing, changing shifts when absolutely necessary. The idea of specially designed menstrual cloths was more common among wealthier households, where women had servants to launder them. Religious writings often declared menstruating women unclean. In some communities, women were discouraged from entering churches or handling holy objects during their periods. This stigma weighed heavily, teaching women that their natural cycles were shameful. Imagine a small stone cottage. A mother quietly rinses a blood-stained cloth in a wooden bucket, hoping no man sees. Her daughter, just entering womanhood, is handed her first rag, along with whispered instructions and warnings. There was no celebration, only silence, secrecy, and sometimes fear. Beliefs and superstitions. Beyond stigma, medieval Europe fostered strange superstitions about menstrual blood. Some texts claimed that if a woman's menstrual blood touched crops, they would wither. If it touched wine, the wine would sour. Others believed menstrual blood could dull, steal, kill bees, or drive dogs mad. These beliefs reinforce fear of women's bodies, casting natural cycles as dangerous and polluting. At the same time, midwives and folk healers sometimes used menstrual blood in remedies. Certain charms for fertility or protection called for it, reflecting the strange duality feared as poison, yet secretly believed to hold power. Childbirth in medieval times. If menstruation was taboo, childbirth was both sacred and terrifying. For medieval women, giving birth was the most dangerous moment of life. Without modern medicine, mortality was high for both mothers and infants. Hygiene practices surrounding childbirth reveal both desperation and resilience. Pregnant women were often advised to avoid bathing again from fear of opening pores and weakening the body. Instead, they might rub themselves with oils or vinegar, hoping to ward off illness. During labor, the birthing room was filled with symbolic objects, relics of saints, protective herbs like sage and rue, and crosses carved into walls or doors. Midwives oversaw most births. Their knowledge came from experience rather than books, for universities excluded women. A midwife's tools were simple sharp knives or scissors, linen cloths, warm water, and herbal remedies. Cleanliness in our sense was absent. Hands were rarely washed with soap, and instruments were not sterilized. Infection was common, though its causes were unknown. Consider the scene: a woman writhes in labor on a straw-stuffed mattress. Her midwife presses a cross into her hand while another woman sprinkles holy water nearby. A pot of herbs steams in the corner, meant to purify the air. Linen cloths wait to wrap the infant. Outside neighbors pray the screams do not end in silence. Postpartum hygiene. After birth, hygiene practices were equally rudimentary. Mothers were churched or ritually purified before being allowed to rejoin the community. Until then, they were considered spiritually unclean. The mother's body was often washed with vinegar or wine, rubbed with oils, or swaddled in fresh linen, but true bathing was avoided. Newborns were swaddled tightly in bands of cloth, sometimes so tightly their limbs could barely move. This was believed to shape the body properly. Hygiene for infants consisted of wiping with cloths and sprinkling herbs in cradles. Diapers were linen strips, washed rarely. The smell of infancy mingled with the smell of sickness, herbs, and unwashed bodies. Medical texts and advice. Medieval medical manuscripts reveal both attempts at understanding and absurdity. Some doctors advised women to balance humors with bloodletting during pregnancy. Others recommended specific foods, almonds, eggs, and warm wine for strength. To ease childbirth, women might be given concoctions of herbs, sometimes mixed with dangerous substances like mercury or lead. Pain relief was limited. Ale, opium, or simply biting on a cloth were the main options. There was no concept of antiseptic practice, and so fevers, infections, and death loomed large. It is estimated that as many as 1 in 3 women might die from complications across their childbearing years. Daily struggles. Behind all of this were daily struggles few recorded. A peasant woman working in fields while managing menstruation with a single rag. A noblewoman hidden in her chamber tended by maids who discreetly laundered her cloths. A midwife rushing through muddy streets at midnight clutching a pouch of herbs and a small knife. These are the quiet, unglamorous truths of medieval hygiene, rarely painted in manuscripts or sung in poems, but lived by countless women. Reflections. It is tempting to judge the past harshly, to recoil at the absence of soap sterilization or compassion. Yet for these women, such practices were not choices, but conditions of life. They endured because they had to. Their hygiene habits, strange as they seem, were acts of survival. Each cloth washed, each herb gathered, each whispered prayer over a laboring mother was part of a long, fragile chain that carried humanity forward. As we close this part, let us honor their endurance. For beneath the disgusting habits lay resilience, creativity, and an unyielding will to live. Their struggles remind us that history is not only about kings or wars, but about ordinary women carrying extraordinary burdens. Part will continue with cosmetics, medical treatments, and peculiar beauty rituals of medieval women. In the dim candlelight of medieval chambers, another side of hygiene emerged. Not the cleansing of dirt, but the pursuit of beauty and health through cosmetics and treatments that were often more harmful than helpful. For medieval women, the line between medicine and vanity blurred, and what we might call hygiene today was deeply intertwined with appearance, belief, and dangerous experimentation. The medieval ideal of beauty was not a matter of personal expression. It was a statement of virtue, wealth, and even spiritual purity. Pale skin was considered the height of beauty, for it suggested a woman was wealthy enough to stay indoors away from the sunlit fields. Smooth, hairless faces were desired, along with high foreheads, bright eyes, and delicate hands. To achieve these ideals, women turned to cosmetics and treatments that could be as hazardous as they were bizarre. Skin whitening practices. To keep their skin pale, medieval women used powders made of ground alabaster chalk or even lead. Lead-based cosmetics were especially popular, despite their toxicity. Applied to the face, they gave a ghostly whiteness, masking blemishes but slowly poisoning the skin and body. Some texts suggest that women would also bathe their faces in vinegar or sour milk, believing the acids kept their skin fair. Imagine a noblewoman before her mirror, a servant grinding chalk into fine powder, mixing it with water to create a paste. The noblewoman dabs it on her cheeks, pleased by the pale glow it gives. Neither she nor her maid understands the silent damage seeping into her blood. Removing hair, facial hair, especially around the forehead, was seen as unfeminine. Women sought to remove or conceal it to achieve the high, smooth forehead admired by poets and painters. Recipes for hair removal included concoctions of quicklime, arsenic, and vinegar. These mixtures could burn the skin, leaving scars. Yet the desire for beauty drove women to endure the pain. Some even plucked their hairline back several centimeters to raise the forehead, creating the fashionable look of an almost bald brow. Portraits from the late Middle Ages show women with unnaturally high hairlines, the result of endless plucking and scraping. Rouge and lip color. Although pale skin was prized, a touch of red was considered healthy. Women used crushed berries, red ochre, or even mercury-based compounds to color their lips and cheeks. These provided fleeting beauty, but came with long-term harm. Mercury in particular caused tremors, weakness, and madness when absorbed through the skin. Teeth and breath dental hygiene was rudimentary. Women chewed herbs like mint or parsley to freshen breath or rub their teeth with cloth dipped in salt or ashes. Powdered charcoal was another common cleanser. These methods provided temporary relief, but did little to prevent decay. Cavities, infections, and tooth loss were widespread, often accepted as inevitable parts of life. Bad breath was common, so much so that perfumes and scented waters were considered essential. A lady might carry a silver flask of rosewater to rinse her mouth discreetly before social gatherings. Once again, scent stood in for cleanliness. Eyes and vision. Eyes were believed to be windows to the soul, and medieval texts contain numerous recipes for eye waters. Some were harmless mixtures of herbs, but others included dangerous substances like copper salts or antimony. These were dripped into the eyes to brighten them, though the irritation often caused more damage than improvement. Strange medical treatments. Beyond cosmetics, women also endured bizarre medical treatments under the guise of hygiene and health. Bloodletting was one such practice. Doctors believed that balancing the body's four humors required removing excess blood. Women might be bled regularly, weakening them instead of providing strength. Other treatments included purges with laxatives, fumigations with burning herbs, and the application of poultices made from animal dung. Yes, even dung was used, believed to draw out toxins or heal wounds. To us, these practices are repulsive, but to them they were remedies handed down through generations. The ritual of the bath for the wealthy few. Though common women rarely bathed, wealthy noblewomen sometimes enjoyed ritual baths. These were less about hygiene and more about luxury. Bathing tubs were filled with warm water, scented with herbs, flowers, and even wine. Servants stood by with towels and sponges. Yet even these baths were infrequent, reserved for special occasions. Afterward, women dusted themselves with powders and perfumes, layering scent upon scent to project cleanliness. Jewelry and amulets. Another part of beauty and hygiene came from the belief in protective objects. Women wore amulets against disease, sometimes containing written prayers or small relics. Coral beads were thought to protect against illness and miscarriage. Hygiene, medicine, and magic blended seamlessly in these practices, reflecting a worldview where the physical and spiritual could not be separated. Daily life, a composite picture. Consider the daily routine of a medieval noblewoman. In the morning, she wipes her face with rosewater, applies lead-based powder to her cheeks, and plucks her forehead hairline. She chews mint leaves to freshen her breath, then dons a linen shift beneath layers of gowns. Before visitors arrive, she sprinkles herself with perfume and fastens a small pomander at her waist. She looks clean, smells sweet, and appears fashionable, yet beneath the surface, her body bears the hidden costs of these rituals. A peasant woman's reality was harsher. She had no powders or perfumes, relying only on occasional cloth washing, herbal sachets, and sheer endurance. Her beauty was judged not by cosmetics, but by her ability to labor, bear children, and survive. Reflections. When we study these cosmetic and medical practices, we see more than just disgusting habits. We see the lengths to which women went to meet expectations to survive and to find dignity in a world that gave them few choices. Their treatments may seem reckless, but they were acts of hope for beauty, for health, for acceptance. And hope, fragile though it was, sustained them through the long centuries. Next part will continue with social perceptions, court life, and the clash between noble and peasant hygiene in the medieval world. In the medieval world, hygiene was not only about personal practices, it was also about perception. How one smelled, looked, or presented oneself became a powerful marker of status and morality. For women, especially, the divide between noble and peasant hygiene was vast, yet both were bound by the same cultural beliefs that shaped medieval Europe. The social meaning of smell. To modern people, a foul odor signals neglect. In the Middle Ages, however, everyone lived surrounded by strong smells. Streets were filled with refuse chamber, pots were emptied out of windows, and livestock lived side by side with humans. Against this backdrop, personal odors became less noticeable, even accepted. A woman who smelled strongly of sweat or smoke was not unusual. What mattered was how her scent compared to others. Among nobles, perfumes and scented oils provided a way to rise above the common stench. A lady, perfumed with rosewater, projected refinement, even if she rarely bathed. Among peasants, a sachet of herbs at the waist was enough to signal an attempt at cleanliness. Smell became a form of silent language marking class and intent. Courtly life and noblewomen. At court, appearances mattered immensely. Noblewomen were expected to embody grace and purity. They wore layers of fine linen under lavish gowns, ensuring they could change garments frequently. Servants laundered these linens, giving the illusion of cleanliness even when baths were rare. In great halls, noble women sat adorned with jewelry and silks, their bodies perfumed with musk or lavender. Yet beneath the finery, lice still crawled in hair and sores from lead-based cosmetics festered. Hygiene was theatrical, performed for the gaze of others. Court records describe banquets where nobles dined on rich foods, while servants discreetly cleaned away messes. Afterward, perfumed cloths were passed around to wipe hands and faces. To guests, this was luxury. To us, it reveals a world where scent and fabric substituted for water and soap. Peasant realities. In contrast, peasant women lived lives of relentless labor. Their hands were rough from field work, their nails embedded with soil. Water from wells or rivers was used sparingly, often too precious for bathing. Instead, peasants relied on smoke from hearth fires to mask odors and on simple linen shifts to absorb sweat. When shifts became too dirty, they were beaten clean in rivers or scrubbed with ashes. Despite these hardships, peasants were resilient. They created herbal rinses, chewed plants to freshen breath, and used natural resources creatively. For them, hygiene was not about appearances, but survival. Judgment and morality. Hygiene was deeply tied to morality. A woman considered too clean might be judged as vain or even promiscuous. Conversely, a woman with no regard for hygiene could be shamed for laziness or impurity. Women walked a fine line, balancing expectations of modesty with the harsh realities of medieval life. Religious authorities reinforced these views. Priests preached against vanity, urging women to avoid excessive bathing or cosmetics. At the same time, they demanded purity, condemning women whose appearance fell below expectations. This contradiction left women trapped, judged, no matter which path they took. Noble versus peasant medicine. Medical advice reflected class differences as well. Noble women had access to physicians who prescribed costly remedies like saffron baths or exotic ointments. Peasant women relied on midwives and folk healers, using local herbs and homemade concoctions. Both groups faced risks. Noble remedies often contained toxic substances, while peasant treatments were inconsistent and sometimes ineffective. For example, a noblewoman might bathe her face in a solution of wine and rare spices, believing it strengthened her complexion. A peasant woman might wash with nettle or chamomile tea, hoping to ease rashes. Different methods, same desire to cope with the challenges of hygiene in a world without modern science. The role of public bathhouses. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, though their reputation declined over the centuries. Initially seen as places of community, they grew associated with immorality and disease. For noble women, visiting a bathhouse risked gossip and scandal. For peasant women, it was often unaffordable. As a result, bathhouses became rare refuges, more social than hygienic. When women did visit, they soaked in warm water infused with herbs. They chatted, exchanged remedies, and momentarily escaped daily burdens. These moments remind us that even in the harshest conditions, women sought comfort and connection. Cultural contrasts. Travelers in the Middle Ages often remarked on differences in hygiene across regions. Arabs and Persians, with traditions of bathing and perfumed oils, found Europeans shockingly dirty. Their accounts describe noble women caked in powders but unwashed beneath. Such observations reveal that hygiene was not universal but shaped by culture and geography. The hidden burden on women. Ultimately, hygiene placed a disproportionate burden on women. They were expected to maintain appearances for families, care for children, launder clothing, and prepare remedies. Whether noble or peasant women bore the invisible labor of hygiene. Men might dismiss it, but women lived it daily. Reflections. Social perception in the Middle Ages reminds us that hygiene was more than personal. It was political, cultural, and deeply gendered. To be a woman was to navigate endless contradictions, to smell sweet but not too sweet, to appear pure but not vain, to survive in filth while projecting grace. In this struggle, medieval women displayed resilience that deserves recognition today. Next part, we'll explore the darker consequences of poor hygiene disease epidemics and the role women played in both spreading and surviving them. In the shadow of medieval life, the greatest consequence of poor hygiene was disease. For women who bore the responsibility of caring for families and managing households, epidemics were not abstract threats, they were daily realities. This part explores how hygiene habits contributed to sickness, how women endured plagues, and the crucial roles they played in survival. The constant presence of disease illness was a familiar companion in medieval Europe. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, and tuberculosis haunted towns and villages. Without understanding germs, people attributed sickness to foul smells, curses, or divine punishment. Women's hygiene practices, rare bathing, reuse of dirty cloths, and close living quarters unintentionally helped disease spread. Imagine a crowded cottage children share beds stuffed with straw parents, sleep nearby, and animals huddle in the same space for warmth. Lice, fleas, and rats thrive in this environment, carrying unseen killers like typhus and bubonic plague. In such conditions, hygiene was not a defense, but a breeding ground. The Black Death. No discussion of medieval disease is complete without the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, the plague swept across Europe, killing nearly half the population. Hygiene, or the lack of it, played a crucial role. Fleas carried by rats spread the disease rapidly through filthy streets and homes. For women, the plague was especially devastating. They nursed the sick-washed, soiled linens and prepared bodies for burial. These acts of care exposed them to infection. Records describe entire families wiped out, with women often among the first to fall ill because of their intimate role in caregiving. Yet women also became chroniclers of resilience. Midwives and healers experimented with herbal fumigations, burning rosemary and juniper to purify the air. Mothers stitched protective charms into children's clothing. Though powerless against the plague, these rituals gave hope and structure amid despair. Childbed fever and everyday infections. Even outside epidemics, women faced constant threats from poor hygiene. Childbirth was one of the deadliest moments, with childbed fever claiming countless lives. Midwives lacking sterile practices often carried infections from one delivery to the next. Dirty cloths, unwashed hands, and crowded birthing rooms created perfect conditions for bacteria to spread, though no one knew the cause. Skin infections, boils, and fevers were common. Women treated them with poultices of herbs, clay, or even animal dung. While some remedies soothed, others worsened the wounds. Without soap or antiseptics, even minor cuts could become fatal. Leprosy and social stigma. Leprosy was another feared disease, one that carried immense stigma. Though not directly caused by hygiene, its visible sores were associated with filth and sin. Women with leprosy were often cast out, forced into isolated colonies. Their hygiene practices became irrelevant for society, saw them only as cursed. This reveals how perceptions of cleanliness shaped not just health but identity. Religious explanations. Religion provided explanations for disease that shaped women's responses. Illness was seen as punishment for sin or a test of faith. Women were encouraged to endure sickness patiently, offering their suffering as spiritual sacrifice. Some sought healing through relics, pilgrimages, or prayers. Holy water and blessed oils were applied as remedies, blending hygiene with faith. This spiritual framework gave meaning to suffering but often discouraged practical solutions. Washing was seen less as prevention and more as ritual purification. The link between cleanliness and health, though intuitively recognized, was overshadowed by theology. Community responses. During epidemics, communities turned to women for support. Women cared for neighbors, distributed food, and maintained households when men fled or died. Their knowledge of herbs, though limited, provided some relief. Garlic, onion, and vinegar were used against infections, while lavender and sage were burned to cleanse the air. These acts may not have stopped disease, but they created networks of care that sustained communities. In towns, women also worked as laundresses, washing soiled clothing in rivers. Though dangerous, their labor was essential to controlling outbreaks. These unsung acts highlight the dual role of women as both victims and defenders against disease. The emotional toll. Disease brought not only physical suffering but emotional trauma. Mothers buried children, daughters buried parents, and communities were torn apart. Women's diaries and folk songs reveal grief interwoven with resilience. Hygiene rituals, washing a body, anointing with herbs, dressing in clean linen, became ways to honor the dead and preserve dignity amid horror. The slow shift toward awareness. By the late Middle Ages, small shifts began. Observers noted that cities with better waste management suffered fewer outbreaks. Physicians started recommending hand washing with wine or vinegar before childbirth. Though still far from modern hygiene, these small changes planted seeds of awareness that future generations would grow. Reflections disease in the medieval world shows us the limits of hygiene, but also the depth of women's courage. They endured epidemics, cared for the dying, and sought remedies in herbs and prayer. Their hygiene habits may seem disgusting to us, but they were born of necessity and ignorance. Above all, they reveal the resilience of women who faced death daily, yet continued to nurture life. Next part will cover fashion, fabric, care, and the strange connection between laundry, linen, and concepts of cleanliness in medieval Europe. When we think of hygiene, we often imagine soap water and regular bathing. But in the medieval world, especially for women, hygiene was closely linked to clothing and fabric care. Clean linen was considered almost the same as a clean body. In this part, we will explore how fashion and fabric became substitutes for bathing, and how laundering practices defined ideas of cleanliness in medieval Europe. The central role of linen was the foundation of medieval clothing. Women wore linen shifts directly against the skin beneath layers of wool or silk. These undergarments absorbed sweat oils and dirt. Since bathing was rare, changing linen became the primary method of washing. To put on a fresh shift was to cleanse oneself even if the body remained unwashed. For noblewomen who owned many shifts, this practice created the illusion of constant cleanliness. Servants laundered linen regularly, though the process was laborious. For peasants with only 1 or 2 shifts, the reality was harsher. They wore their linen until it stiffened with grime, washing only when absolutely necessary. Fashion and modesty clothing also reflected morality. Women were judged by how they dressed with cleanliness tied to virtue. A stained or smelly garment might invite whispers of laziness or impurity. Noble women wore layers not just for warmth, but to project refinement. Linen cuffs and collars peeking out from gowns signaled freshness, even if the woman herself had not bathed in months. Fashion trends reinforced this association. High foreheads, elaborate veils, and trailing gowns required constant fabric care. A noblewoman's appearance was as much about the state of her linen as the state of her body. The art of laundering laundry was women's work, and it was grueling. Linen was soaked, beaten, scrubbed with ashes or lye, and rinsed in rivers or tubs. Clothes were spread on grass or bushes to dry sunlight, believed to purify them. Noble households employed laundresses, while peasant women managed their own, often gathering together at riversides. These communal washings were social events filled with gossip songs and shared labor. Despite the effort, laundering was infrequent. A noblewoman might have her shifts washed weekly, while a peasant woman washed hers only monthly or seasonally. Yet in both cases, clean linen was a prized possession guarded carefully. Perfumed fabrics. To enhance the illusion of cleanliness, fabrics were sometimes perfumed. Noble women sprinkled garments with rose water or stored them with herbs like lavender and sage. Cedar chests protected clothing from moths and added fragrance. These scents masked odors and reinforced the association between smell and cleanliness. The symbolism of white linen. White linen held special meaning. Its brightness symbolized purity and status, since keeping it white required resources. A bride's trousseau often included fine white linen, signifying her family's wealth and her own virtue. Religious rituals also emphasized white linen with altars and vestments draped in it, mirroring women's undergarments as symbols of purity. For peasants, linen was often rougher and darker, stained from labor and difficult to whiten. The contrast between noble and peasant linen reflected broader social divides, making fabric itself a marker of class. The burden on women managing clothing was another hidden burden placed on women. They spun, wove, sewed, laundered, and mended fabrics. A woman's skill with linen reflected her worth as a wife and mother. Young girls learned from their mothers, beginning with simple stitches and progressing to complex embroidery. For noble women, embroidery became an art form. For peasants, it was survival. Laundry days were backbreaking, with women hauling water, heating cauldrons, and scrubbing cloths. Hands cracked from lye and cold water. Yet this labor was invisible, taken for granted as part of women's roles. Fashion, as armor clothing, also functioned as a kind of armor against the filth of daily life. Long gowns and layers protected skin from dirt, insects, and weather. Veils and wimples shielded hair, keeping lice somewhat at bay. Shoes, when worn, offered protection from streets littered with refuse. For women, fashion was not merely decoration. It was defense in a hostile environment. Peasant women with fewer resources relied on ingenuity. They used herbal rinses to freshen clothing, repurposed worn linen into rags or menstrual cloths, and patched garments until nothing remained. Old garments were handed down, altered, and reused endlessly. In this cycle, fabric became life itself, carrying the traces of work, childbirth, and survival. Reflections. In medieval Europe, cleanliness was less about soap and water than about fabric and fashion. For women, linen was both shield and burden symbol and necessity. Their hygiene habits may seem disgusting to us, but they reveal a world where fabric itself bore the weight of purity and identity. To wear clean linen was to declare oneself whole, even when the body remained untouched by water. Next part, we'll explore hygiene in religious institutions, convents, nuns, and the contradictions of purity and filth in the spiritual lives of medieval women. Behind cloister walls, medieval nuns lived lives devoted to prayer, discipline, and service. Yet even in these sacred spaces, hygiene reflected the contradictions of the age. Convents were places of spiritual purity, but also of physical neglect. For women who sought holiness, the body was both enemy and vessel, leading to habits that we might find shocking today. Restrictions on bathing. In convents, bathing was heavily restricted. Many religious rules permitted full immersion in water only a few times a year. Nuns were warned that frequent bathing encouraged vanity and tempted the flesh. To wash too often was to indulge the body rather than discipline the soul. Instead, nuns relied on changing linen garments as their main form of cleanliness. The result was that many women spent months without touching water to skin. To modern readers, this seems unthinkable, but to them it was an act of obedience and devotion. Hair and veiling hair was treated as a source of temptation. Upon entering the convent, women often had their heads shaved as a sign of humility. This also reduced lice infestations, though not entirely. Nuns wore veils at nearly all times, covering hair and scalp. The veil itself absorbed sweat and odors, yet was rarely washed, carrying the same grime and pests as the body beneath. Daily hygiene practices. Daily hygiene for nuns centered on modest acts, wiping the face and hands with damp cloths, sprinkling vinegar or rose water for scent, and changing linen shifts when possible. Perfume was discouraged, though herbs like sage and lavender were sometimes permitted for health. The austerity of convent life meant that filth was endured as part of spiritual discipline. In some convents, women shared dormitories with dozens of others sleeping on straw mattresses. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived. Complaints survive in letters from abbesses who begged patrons for funds to buy cleaner bedding or more linen. Yet these problems were rarely solved. The paradox of purity. The paradox was stark. Nuns were seen as models of purity, yet their hygiene habits often left them filthy. To medieval minds, however, purity was spiritual, not physical. Dirt and odor were secondary compared to chastity, prayer, and obedience. A nun who smelled unpleasant might still be revered as holy, while one who cared too much for appearance risked scandal. Medical care in convents. Convents often served as centers of healing. Nuns tended the sick, prepared herbal remedies, and washed wounds. Yet even here, practices reflected limited understanding. Instruments were unclean, and herbs were applied without knowledge of bacteria. Still, for many communities, convents were the only source of medical aid. Nuns themselves were not spared from illness. Crowded dormitories spread fevers quickly. Childbed fever did not affect them, but malnutrition, respiratory diseases, and skin infections were common. Hygiene practices, or the lack thereof, contributed to this cycle. Spiritual symbolism of dirt. Some saints embraced filth as a sign of holiness. Stories tell of nuns who refused to wash, wore the same clothing until it rotted, or lived among vermin as acts of humility. Their stench was described as proof of sanctity, their endurance of filth, a spiritual triumph. To us, this seems grotesque. To them, it was devotion. Communal washing. When permitted, communal washing days were events. Nuns gathered at rivers or wells, scrubbing garments while chanting psalms. These occasions were practical, but also spiritual, linking physical cleansing with prayer. The water, though cold and dirty, symbolized renewal. Contrast with laywomen. Compared to laywomen, nuns endured stricter restrictions, but sometimes enjoyed more resources. Wealthy convents provided better linen and herbal supplies. Poorer ones struggled with rags and vermin. In either case, the gap between spiritual ideals and physical reality remained. Reflections. The hygiene of nuns reveals the contradictions of medieval thought. Purity was spiritual, not physical. Dirt was tolerated, even embraced as part of devotion. Yet within this filth, nuns cared for the sick, preserved knowledge of herbs, and offered comfort to communities. Their lives remind us that history cannot be judged by modern standards alone, but must be understood within its own beliefs and struggles. Next part will examine hygiene among prostitutes and marginalized women, where survival demanded practices both practical and shocking. While noble women and nuns lived under rules of status or faith, prostitutes and marginalized women navigated survival through entirely different means. Hygiene for these women was shaped by necessity, danger, and the expectations of clients or communities that both depended on and despised them. Their practices reveal a side of medieval life that was rarely recorded, yet essential to understanding the full picture of women's hygiene. Life on the margins. Prostitutes occupied a precarious place in medieval society. Tolerated in many towns as necessary evils, they were often confined to red light districts near city gates or rivers. Official brothels sometimes existed under municipal control, with rules meant to contain vice. Hygiene in these environments was minimal, yet the pressure to appear desirable demanded constant improvisation. Women on the margins, widows, beggars, orphans, sometimes drifted into sex work out of desperation. Without resources, their hygiene depended on what little they could scavenge or invent. The result was habits that shocked outsiders, but became survival strategies for them. Bathing and washing. Unlike noblewomen, prostitutes occasionally had access to bathhouses. These establishments, though declining in reputation, provided warm water and a place to cleanse. Some brothels maintained tubs for washing, not for health but for allure. Women bathed to mask odors, though soap was rare. Instead, they used mixtures of herbs, vinegar, or even wine to rinse the body. Yet conditions were far from sanitary. Water was reused, tubs unclean, and infections rampant. Skin diseases spread easily, and lice and fleas were constant companions. Still, for women whose livelihood depended on appearance, these baths were indispensable. Perfumes and concealment perfume played a central role in the lives of prostitutes. Strong scents masked unwashed bodies and suggested luxury. Musk, civet, and ambergris animal-based perfumes were particularly popular, their heavy odors lingering in taverns and brothels. Cheaper alternatives included sachets of herbs or dabbing vinegar on clothes. Cosmetics, though dangerous, were also common. Red rouge for cheeks and lips made from ochre or mercury was applied to attract clients. Kohl or soot-darkened eyes, lending a dramatic look in candlelit rooms. These touches created illusions of vitality, even as they harmed the body. Venereal disease. One of the greatest hazards for prostitutes was venereal disease, though it was poorly understood. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread widely in the later Middle Ages. Without treatment, symptoms were horrifying: sores, fevers, and madness. Prostitutes more exposed than others bore the brunt. Remedies were crude ointments of mercury, fumigations, or prayers. Communities often blamed prostitutes for spreading disease, branding them unclean. Yet in truth, hygiene practices across society made everyone vulnerable. Prostitutes were scapegoats, punished for conditions no one could control. Marginalized women's hygiene. Beyond prostitutes, marginalized women like beggars and outcasts faced even harsher realities. With no access to linen, perfumes, or baths, they lived in filth. Accounts describe women sleeping in barns covered in rags, hair crawling with lice. Their hygiene was not a choice, but a reflection of poverty. Society judged them harshly, equating dirt with sin while offering little relief. Some women used ingenious methods, rubbing skin with ashes to absorb oils, combing hair with fish bones, or rinsing with rainwater. These practices highlight resilience, but also the cruelty of a world that abandoned them. Public perception prostitutes were paradoxically both desirable and despised. Town authorities taxed them, churchmen preached against them, and ordinary citizens both visited and shunned them. Their hygiene became part of the moral narrative. Foul smells and disease were seen as signs of sin, while perfumes and finery were condemned as vanity. Women could not win; whether clean or dirty, they were judged. Stories from the records court documents and chronicles occasionally mention prostitutes' hygiene. In one German town, rules required prostitutes to bathe weekly in public baths. In another, women were forbidden from wearing fine linen to prevent them from appearing too much like respectable wives. Such regulations reveal how hygiene was policed not for health, but for social order. Reflections. The hygiene habits of prostitutes and marginalized women show us the extremes of medieval life. Stripped of status or sanctity, they lived in a world where survival demanded compromise. Their baths were shallow, their perfumes heavy, their cosmetics dangerous, but all were tools of endurance. To judge them by modern standards is to miss the resilience they embodied. In filth and fragrance alike, they carved a place in a society that denied them dignity. As our journey through the hygiene habits of medieval women draws to a close, let us pause and reflect. We have traveled from noble courts to peasant cottages, from convent dormitories to crowded brothels. We have seen how women's lives were shaped by beliefs about water, fabric, perfume, and purity. What appears to us as disgusting was for them a daily reality, an act of survival in a world without modern science. The human side of history. It is easy to laugh or recoil at the filth of the Middle Ages, but behind every practice was a woman trying to endure. Whether she dabbed her face with lead-based powder, washed a rag in secret, or carried herbs at her waist, she was participating in a cultural system that defined her worth and her place. For noblewomen, hygiene meant layers of linen and clouds of perfume. For peasants, it meant smoke, sweat, and resilience. For nuns, it meant rejecting the body in pursuit of spiritual purity. For prostitutes, it meant navigating danger with baths, cosmetics, and perfume. Each path, however, different, reveals the weight of expectations carried by women. Lessons from the past. From these habits, we learn how deeply culture shapes cleanliness. We learn that clean is not universal, but defined by time, place, and belief. We see the cruelty of judgment, how women were shamed, whether they were too clean or too dirty, too perfumed or too plain. And we glimpse resilience in the way women found dignity amid filth, hope amid despair. Echoes in the present. Though centuries have passed, echoes remain. We still attach morality to appearance. We still judge women by how they dress, smell, or present themselves. The story of medieval hygiene reminds us to look deeper to see the human struggle behind the surface. Closing thoughts. As we close this exploration, let us honor the endurance of medieval women. They lived in conditions we would find unbearable, yet they laughed, prayed, loved, and endured. Their habits, strange as they seem, carried humanity forward. Without them, we would not be here. Outro with CTA. Thank you for joining Time's gentle historian, Medieval Lifetimes, on this long journey. If you found peace and fascination in these stories, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from and which part of medieval hygiene surprised you the most. Your presence helps this community grow, and together, we will continue to uncover the quiet, overlooked stories of the past. Stories that soothe, enlighten, and remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, may your nights be restful, your thoughts gentle, and your curiosity endless.